been fighting a long time, and we have all lost so very much, so many loved ones gone. But you are not alone. There are pockets of resistance all around the planet. We are at the brink. You have no idea how important you are. If you're listening to this, you are the resistance.
Ave Maria Stella Dei Mater Alma ad semper Virgo Felix te.
Welcome everybody, Steve coming at you once again with Dr. Alan Fimister. He's on remote, but we're still going to talk about the Council of Vienne. Doctor, welcome back.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
No problem. Everyone's loving the series, by the way. Thank you again, as always, for doing this. Nice haircut, by the way.
Oh, thanks. Yes, finally, my wife took the shears to me. So the Council of Vienne, 1311 to 1312. What number ecumenical council is it? I suppose it's the 14th. Is that right? I hope I'm not getting the numbers wrong.
I lost count after 5.
Say again, sorry.
I lost count after 5.
Yes. So it's held in France. It's I think I looked at a map. I think it's very slightly less northwest than Lyon. So it's moved slightly further back towards the centre of the Mediterranean, but. It's not a terror, not an edifying council. I'm afraid the rest of the councils for the rest of the Middle Ages, with the exception of the Council of Florence, they're not necessarily boring, but they're not very infusing. They all represent some disaster or other, and so this is one of the disasters. I mean, it does some good things on the way, but yeah. So. In 1291, the city of Acre, I think we mentioned last time, fell to Islam, and that was the last stronghold of the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem. They hadn't had Jerusalem for a while. Remember, they rented it back under the dubious auspices of the Emperor Frederick II, we talked about last time, but it was taken back again by Islam shortly after that, as was predictable. Hence the annoyance of the barons of the Kingdom of Jerusalem at Frederick II's antics, and they clung on to less and less of the Holy Land until eventually they were driven out in 1291, and that was kind of it, really, except that the Kingdom of Cyprus was still in the possession of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The King of Cyprus was also the titular King of Jerusalem. But it was all pretty depressing, and there'd been no really successful crusading action that made a significant impact over the course of the 13th century. St. Louis IX had made some valiant attempts, but they'd all sort of run aground in one way or another. And so this was a really big downer for Christendom, and a big downer for the papacy, because the popes were a big part of their prestige and their claim to leadership over Christendom was the Crusades and the success of the First Crusade, and now that was all kind of gone. So we already talked last time about how there'd been this decline, greater and greater venality and sort of bureaucratic sclerosis surrounding the Holy See, and moral decline among the cardinals, and now the last territory on the mainland of the Holy Land was lost, and I think we also talked about last time the fact that the popes have been fighting this furious battle with the Western emperors over who were the real leaders of Christendom, and that had reached a fever pitch in the reign of Frederick II. And after Frederick II's death in 1250, they'd sort of hounded his dynasty to destruction, and in fact there was no emperor crowned by the Pope or crowned in Rome until 1312. So from the death of Frederick II, who died, deposed excommunicate anyway, but from the death of Frederick II until the coronation of the Emperor Henry VII, There was no one in 1312. There was technically no one who was Holy Roman Emperor, and in fact, by the time Henry VII was crowned in Rome, he was crowned by 3 cardinals, because the popes weren't in Rome for reasons that we'll get to, and wouldn't be back to Rome for another half a century plus after that coronation. So, which is another serious sign of the general deterioration.
Mm-hmm.
So this, and the problem this created, this sort of breaking, and the Emperor Henry VII didn't. Dante was very excited about it, thought he was going to restore the empire as a big deal, but nothing really came of it. And so the empire was kind of broken as as an entity or institution with any real chance of leading Christendom. It was now a sort of pretty weak monarchy of Germany with a fancy and rather incongruous title about being Roman Emperor. It didn't really. Its claim to leadership in Christendom was now almost a dead letter. Now, some chance of that came back in the 16th century when the King of Spain was elected Holy Roman Emperor, and he was immensely powerful. Although it didn't work out because of Protestantism. But anyway, so and the big problem with having broken the empire as an institution is that the popes had a real control over the empire. It was built into the Romanness of Christendom and the papal office and all that kind of stuff. So the very reasons that made it a threat to the popes' claimed universal leadership of Christendom also made it susceptible of control by the popes to some degree, and also emphasized that the universal reality of Christendom was the fundamental sort of focus of loyalty for Western Latins. And so by breaking the empire in that way, the popes had actually unleashed the the local monarchies to become much more powerful and problematic. And I don't think they properly appreciated how dangerous that was going to be. Okay, so one of the consequences of the moral panic created by the fall of Acre was that the cardinals decided to elect this hermit as the pope. They thought, well, if we just find this really holy guy who's got nothing to do with the Holy See and its bureaucratic structures and its corruption, then somehow everything will be okay. Because their understanding was somebody must have sinned. I mean, this is a rather Old Testament understanding, but nevertheless, somebody must have sinned, because we've lost the Holy Land, we've lost Jerusalem, now we've lost Acre, we've got no footing left there. We've got to do something. And so they elect this poor fellow, and he's utterly miserable. He doesn't know what to do. He's being manipulated left, right, and centre. And he only reigns as Pope from July to December 1294, and it's clearly skidding away to disaster. And so he is persuaded to abdicate. Now, this has a lot of contemporary resonance. Papal abdications can cause a certain amount of confusion, and there's an obvious temptation.
None of that, right?
Yeah. There's an obvious temptation of people who aren't happy with the new regime, whether for good or bad reasons, to cast aspersions on the validity of the abdication. I think Celestine V thought he was going to be able to go home and get back to being a hermit, and instead his successor Boniface VIII had him locked up straight away, and he didn't last very long after his abdication. He's canonized as a saint, in fact. And Benedict XVI went to visit his shrine at least once anyway, and made some strange sort of symbolic actions that hinted towards his possible interest in abdicating himself during his papacy. What their significance was, we never really know. Anyway, so Boniface VIII succeeded Celestine V, and he was kind of completely the opposite end of the spectrum. He was very much a sort of, curial politician with a strong sense of the rights of the papacy, quite shouty, but he didn't really understand how much more limited the power of the papacy had become. I mean, whether he's to be blamed for that or not is not really clear. lots of things are alleged against him because his pontificate became sort of wrapped up in such a storm of controversy, and he had so many people who hated him. But it's hard to tell which bits are invented and which bits aren't. So, like, there's a legend that, you know, when they realised that Celestine V was a bit of a disaster, that they kind of, you know, concealed some kind of sort of voice trumpet somewhere in Celestine V's bedroom, so that Boniface VIII could go. He wasn't yet Boniface VIII could go. Celestine, the Lord speaks. It's time to abdicate, and try and persuade him to go quietly.
Don't you anybody get any ideas out there?
But this could be, you know, one of these nasty stories made up about him by his enemies, and there was a big attempt to try and claim that Boniface had not been validly elected pope later on. So, there's a story that he went to when one of the second of the Habsburgs to be elected emperor, who never actually managed to get crowned. Some of his representatives came to was sent to the Pope to try and, you know, get the papal blessing for the newly elected German king and emperor-elect, and they're supposed to have been ushered into his audience chamber, and he's supposed to have been sitting there enthroned with the imperial regalia himself. This is Boniface VIII, and he's supposed to have said, you know, "I am the emperor, I am Caesar," and all sorts of stuff. But again, who knows? It could be another one of these nasty things made up to disparage the poor fellow. He actually instituted the first Holy Year in 1300, which seems to have been a bit of a money-making endeavour. But anyway, we'll get to why that was. So the reason why he became involved in so much controversy so quickly was because the kings of France and England, Philip IV of France and Edward I of England. Edward I of England is the king and Braveheart. Braveheart is not to be trusted at all as a historical source, but Edward I was quite a kind of formidable chap in that respect.
People are now rending their garments.
So they were at war, as was often the case, and they both were short of cash, and they wanted to raise money from taxing the church. And it had been defined by a couple of previous ecumenical councils, and it had been a source of controversy here and there over the High Middle Ages, but one on which the popes had generally come out on top, albeit with a lot of fighting over it, that you can't seize the property of the ecclesiastical hierarchy. The temporal power basically doesn't have that kind of jurisdiction. Now, there's a little bit of a grey area where some of it is the stuff that's kind of not exactly part of the spiritual mission of the church, not attached to its spiritual functions. But yeah, it's not clear whether or not there might be some things which do fall uncomplicatedly under the jurisdiction of the temporal power and its power to tax, and some things that might not. But in general, you've got to understand that that because the medieval conception was of one society, the church, in which there was the temporal order run by the laity and the spiritual order run by the ecclesiastical hierarchy, the bishops and the pope. It was, to be a cleric was like having diplomatic plates on your car. You know, you were sort of immune from the legal system that applied to the laity, and you could, for certain crimes, be stripped of your clerical status and handed over to the temporal power for prosecution. But that was a decision that lay in the hands of the spiritual power and of the church courts. And so in the same way, property had this kind of immunity. And so to start taxing the church's property, or the property of the hierarchy, without being given special permission to do so by the Holy See, was to question that view of the world and question the immunity and the sovereign nature of the ecclesiastical power relative to the lay power. And so Boniface VIII reacts very strongly against this, and he issues this bull called Clericis Laicos in 1296, in which he denounces these actions. And it's particularly vexatious to the King of France, I think, because the King of France thinks that there might be more chance of it succeeding, whereas I think Edward I might think that he could probably get away. He's far enough away. The English state is sufficiently centralised that he can probably get away with kind of ignoring these measures if he wants to. But Philip IV is furious. The bull itself is not well judged. It starts with this awful opening line, something along the lines of, "It's well known throughout history that the laity have always harboured a nasty resentment against the clergy," or something. It's absolutely bonkers opening line, which is just sort of makes the Pope sound incredibly partisan in favour of the clergy. It sets it up as a laity v clergy dispute, which is not a "I am your holy pastor and father of all believers, and this is a naughty temporal ruler and I'm telling him off on all our behalfs." It sets it up. I mean, he phrases the argument in a really unfortunate way, and so Philip IV reacts very badly to this, and he stops. He claims emergency for emergency reasons because of the war. He has to stop all monies being taken out of the kingdom, so basically cuts off all papal revenue from France, which is a big chunk of the papal revenue. So it's a clever way of putting Boniface VIII in a very difficult situation. And by a year later, in a bull called Etsi de Statu, he backs down and basically says that in emergencies the temporal power can tax the spiritual, the whole landholdings of the spiritual power, and he lets the temporal power judge whether or not it's an emergency. So he kind of phrases it as a concession, but essentially he's kind of surrendering. And so it's not good. And now Philip IV seems like a really nasty character, and he. It's hard to believe that he's inspired by great piety and the terrible things that he goes ahead and does. Weirdly, he had as his tutor a very great theologian and philosopher of the period who's called Giles of Rome, and he's one of the great thinkers of the high and the early part of the late Middle Ages. He was a pupil of St. Thomas Aquinas, and he was a member of the Augustinian friars, and he eventually becomes a bishop and later the superior of the entire Augustinian order. And as I say, he was the tutor of Philip IV when he was a young man, and he wrote a work on political philosophy called De Regimine Principium, which he dedicated to Philip IV, and which doesn't really deal with the spiritual power and its authority in any great detail, and might even be seen as a sort of stage on the way towards the idea of a self-sufficient secular state. So this word hasn't quite emerged yet, but it's in the late Middle Ages. The word state is going to emerge as a term for the temporal community, and the emergence of this word represents a moving away in thought from the idea of a single society of the church in which there is the temporal and spiritual power, towards the idea of an all-sufficient community called the state, ruled over by a sovereign power, in this case the King of France, in which there is an international agency, which the church, which operates under the sufferance of the ruler of that kingdom, of that complete society. And obviously that's very damaging shift in thought from the perspective of the church. Now, so because of the climb down of Boniface VIII, there's then a kind of hiatus in the conflict with the King of France. But then the King of France arrests a bishop in the south of France, ignoring all the rules about the immunity of the clergy. He arrests this bishop and charges him with treason, and he ignores all the proper procedures for what's supposed to be done in these matters, and it immediately reignites the dispute. It's the Bishop of Pamiers in 1301 reignites the dispute with Boniface VIII, and Boniface VIII decides that he just can't be walked all over, and he decides to summon a council to Rome to discuss the misbehaviour of the King of France, and a council largely of French bishops. It's a highly provocative act, but an entirely appropriate act. So Philip IV decides, well, this is serious, and this is an absolute one of us is going to walk away from this defeated and broken, and it's not going to be me. So he decides to summon a rival sort of synod stroke kind of assembly of the kingdom to attack Boniface VIII and denounce his actions. And Philip IV's advisors forge fake documents of Boniface VIII with exaggerated claims of papal dominion over France, as if they deliberately try and confuse the idea of the supreme spiritual power holding both swords in when a tyranny has occurred in the case of the temporal power, with an idea that the Pope's just claiming to be the emperor, which is why these stories about these allegations that Boniface VIII had said, I am the Caesar, I am the emperor, I am Caesar, are so damaging, because this is what the King of France is trying to allege, that the Pope is essentially just trying to take over the government of Christendom, the temporal government of Christendom. So a certain number of bishops, French bishops, come to Rome. A certain number are assembled for the rival assembly of the King of France, and in Rome, at the end of 1302, Boniface VIII issues this infallible bull. It's only 1 page long. It's the most resounding and strident and concise statement of the papal theory of the government of Christendom that was ever issued. It's called Unam Sanctam. It's every Catholic should have it burned into their memory in letters of fire. It's one of the it is one of the most amazing papal documents of all time.
It's one that you should proclaim on a loud bull in the middle of town.
Exactly, that's right. Yes, I'm not sure which town. I have to think about it. But I'll just see if I can summon it up to give you a flavour of the text, because it's pretty, as I say, it's pretty resounding. Let's have a look. Sanctam. This is the opening. Urged by faith, we are obliged to believe and to maintain that the Church is one, holy, Catholic, and also apostolic. We believe in her firmly, and we confess with simplicity that outside of her there is neither salvation nor the remission of sins. As the spouse of the Canticles proclaims, one is my dove, my perfect one. She is the only one, the chosen of her who bore her. And she represents one sole mystical body, whose head is Christ, and the head of Christ is God. In her then is one Lord, one faith, one baptism. There had been at the time of the deluge only one ark of Noah, prefiguring the one church, which ark, having been finished to a single cubit, had only one pilot and guide, that is Noah. And we read that outside of this ark, all that subsisted on the earth was destroyed. Right, so there's the opening. Yeah, absolutely. And but he then goes to describe very quickly, but very clearly, all the full theory of papal government. You got to bear in mind, like the ceremony for the coronation of the Pope with the triple tiara. Which was sort of coming in at this period. When the Cardinal Bishop of Ostia places the tiara on the Pope's head, he says, "Father of princes and kings, ruler of the world, vicar of our Saviour, Jesus Christ." Boom! And then he puts the crown on the Pope's head. So this is the kind of, this is the spirit of this document. And he lays out how at the Last Supper our Lord had said, you've got to acquire. If you don't have a sword, he says to the apostles, sell your cloak and buy a sword. And the apostles say, Lord, here are 2 swords, and our Lord says, it is enough. And then, of course, and so the interpretation given to this from sort of 9th, 10th century onwards is that these two swords are the spiritual and the temporal power, and they both belong ultimately to the supreme authority in the Church, the successor of Saint Peter. And then when our Lord says to Saint Peter after he chops off Malchus's ear in the Garden of Gethsemane, he says, "Put up thy sword into thy scabbard," you think, oh well, that's sort of a bit of a dampener on this theory, but Boniface, he's taking his cue from Saint Bernard of Clairvaux here. When St. Boniface says, oh yeah, but he says, put up thy sword into thy scabbard, right? So it's his sword. You can't deny that the temporal sword is Peter's sword, because our Lord himself says, put up thy sword into thy scabbard. And so his interpretation of this is that although Peter and the clergy in general are not supposed to wield temporal power, they, unless they absolutely have to, which is the argument for the papal states, they're not supposed to wield temporal power, but it still belongs to them. So if the laity, the lay ruler misuses ratione peccati, right? So if he sinfully misuses the temporal sword, because it ultimately belongs to the Pope, to the spiritual power, the spiritual ruler can take it away from him by excommunicating him, which causes him to be outside of that one society of the Church, and so he's no longer part of Christendom, so he can't be a ruler in Christendom. So as it were, the temporal sword drops to the ground because the guy who's wielding it no longer exists, as it were, as a member of Christendom, because he's been excommunicated. And so then the Pope's allowed to pick it up, but he's got to give it to someone else as soon as possible, because he put up thy sword into thy scabbard, so he's not supposed to be using it, but it is his, so he can reassign it. Now, the way this theory worked is not that he couldn't just assign it to whoever he liked. If the normal procedures for selecting a ruler in that country are not complicit in the wicked acts of the ruler, so say the heir to the throne hasn't done the wicked things that the guy the ruler has, so the excommunication doesn't cover him, then it just goes to the heir to the throne. Or if it's an elective kingdom like the Holy Roman Empire, then it goes back to the electors to pick somebody new. So it doesn't mean that the Pope just gets, because otherwise, if there was a perfectly functioning mechanism for picking a ruler who wouldn't be a tyrant, and the Pope were to then pick the ruler, that would be him wielding the temporal power, which is what he's not supposed to do. So anyway, so it's the full-on theory, and it's very resoundingly expressed with all the arguments. As I say, all Catholics should read it. And it's interesting, a lot of sort of kind of soft liberal Catholics, the sort of conservative end of liberalism, as it were, don't like this document because it's very Christendom-y, and it's very definitive. We're obliged to believe and to profess, right? It's not. This isn't like I had an interesting thought the other day, lads. Here's an encyclical. No, this is a kind of, as you say, loudspeaker in the middle of Market Square. All the buttons clicked on, papal infallibility statement. So it's interesting. It's cited in Dominus Jesus, the document that John Paul II produced about the unicity and salvific universality of Jesus Christ and of the Church, and it's cited in a section from the middle of the text, which is quite clever on his part. Is cited by Pope Pius XII. In Mystici Corporis Christi, encyclical on the nature of the Church, which he produced in World War II, and he because some people who, when they try and avoid the infallible status of this text, they try to claim that either only the last line is infallible, or only the first line and the last line is infallible, and the stuff in the middle isn't. But I mean, it's really clearly produced as a kind of creedal, definitive statement. The whole text, which I say is only a page long, is encompassed, and so Pius XII, with an eye to that, I think, in that encyclical, he quotes a line from bang in the middle of the document, and he refers to it as the solemn teaching of our predecessor Pope Boniface VIII. So he's making it clear that the whole text is infallible teaching. So this is like a red rag to a bull. I mean, it's really famous, this document, and it's absolutely slamming down the gauntlet to the temporal power, and to Philip IV in particular. And Philip IV, it becomes utterly enraged, and he produces all of these allegations, everything you could possibly think of. Accused him of having usurped the papacy, bumped off his predecessor, heresy, sodomy, everything he possibly think of. He tries to throw it at Boniface VIII, and he sends a bunch of French soldiers down to attack, literally to attack Boniface VIII. So, and they find him in a town called Anini in September 1303. And the Pope's completely taken by surprise at the impudence and that the King of France would be willing to do. And the King of France, his representative, and the soldiers accompanying him, break into the papal audience chamber and beat Boniface VIII. I mean, he's certainly struck. How badly he's beaten is not completely clear. He's taken captive, and the people of the town, for a number of days, the people of the town eventually rise up and liberate him, and he manages to escape back to Rome, but he dies. So the assault happened on the 7th of September, and he's liberated a few days later, and he gets back to Rome, but he dies on the 11th of October that year, 1303. So some people who think that he was beaten badly think that he died of his injuries. Some people think that he was just so overwhelmed by the humiliation and so shocked that the King of France would be willing to do this to the Pope that he just can't cope, as it were, and he sort of has a mental and physical collapse, and he dies as a consequence of that. So it's a pretty horrendous episode, and it represents, it really shows the moment of the papal government of Christendom has passed. The papacy has now become a disputed power within a Christendom that is ultimately governed by kings and emperors, and no longer really governed by the Pope. And as I say, this was kind of in the post because of the breaking of the empire. It opened the opportunity to the national kings, over whom he didn't have the kind of power that he had over the emperors, to step in and just ultimately this is going to build up towards the secularization and the destruction of Christendom, but to bypass his authority. So a saintly Dominican is elected relatively quickly after the death of Boniface VIII, Pope Clement V. But not Pope Clement V, Pope Benedict IX. But he only reigns for a year or so, slightly less than a year. And then there's a very long conclave. They don't really know what to do. There's a lot of pressure from Philip IV. Philip IV is who's been excommunicated after what he did in Anini. He's been excommunicated and utterly denounced by Boniface VIII before he died. So Philip IV he's not finished with Boniface VIII. He's determined to destroy his reputation. He wants a posthumous condemnation of Boniface VIII, like was done to Pope Honorius at the Third Council of Constantinople. But of course, Pope Honorius had actually done sketchy things on the doctrinal front. A posthumous condemnation of Boniface VIII would not only be unjust, but would be a catastrophic undermining of the doctrine, the defined doctrine contained in Unam Sanctam, and of the true doctrine of the nature of the relations between the temporal and the spiritual power, which was being eaten away by these events. So lots of French pressure on the cardinals. The conclave lasts 11 months, and then finally Clement V is elected Pope. He isn't a cardinal. He's the Archbishop of Bordeaux, which is a part of France which is at that time governed by the King of England, because he's also the Duke of Aquitaine. So he's technically a subject of the King of England, albeit within the nominal frontiers of the Kingdom of France. He isn't a cardinal. He's French. He's in France when he's elected, so he doesn't even know he's being elected. They send off messengers to tell him that he's been elected Pope. So he's elected in June 1305. He doesn't find out for several months afterwards that he's now the Pope. He intends to go back down to Rome, but one reason or another, which we'll get into, he doesn't go down to Rome, and no pope resides in Rome. There's one brief excursion many decades later, but no pope resides in Rome again until for 7 decades. So this is the beginning of the what they call the Babylonian captivity of the papacy. Mm-hmm. Now, people often say the Avignon papacy lasts from 1309 to 1376, but in fact, it's only 1309 is when they moved to Avignon. But Clement V never went to Rome, so from 1305 until 1376, with one very brief trip to Rome later in that period, the popes are absent from Rome itself. So, and this is obviously a terrible scandal, and it's not permissible, and it becomes a question at the Council of Trent that the popes are a bit nervous about. There's some move at the Council of Trent to try and say that it's contrary to divine law, so that even a pope can't dispense from it for a bishop not to reside in his diocese. And the popes are nervous about that because there's this great howling example of this scandalous behaviour of the popes. Now, how far they're culpable, they clearly are culpable. How far they're culpable is for this terrible act is not completely clear. In a certain sense, that you could say they're kind of taken hostage by the French kings. I was asking a 14th century historian a year or so ago about this. How much do you think that they were guilty for this? Were they intentionally hanging around in France, or were they being held hostage? And he said that he'd err on the side of the hostage version, but there was a lot of Stockhausen syndrome going on there. I don't know if you're familiar with the Stockhausen syndrome. It's the phenomenon when a hostage falls in love with the person who's taken them hostage. So that Philip IV persuades Clement V to get crowned in Lyon rather than go back to Rome and get crowned where he's supposed to be. And at the coronation, Clement V creates 9 new French cardinals, and this is not good. So there's already too many French cardinals. Now he's created 9 new French cardinals, and it's not long before, by the time the Avignon captivity ends, there are no Italian cardinals. All the cardinals are French. So so the papacy is completely taken over by France. In fact, we'll deal with this when we get to the Council of Constance, but after the Italians finally get back control of the papacy, no Frenchman is ever elected pope again, to the present day. so yeah, that's they're never allowing that to happen ever again. And
sorry, Rennie.
So so it's pretty bad. And now one thing you got to look at, though, of course, is in fact that the popes for 150, 200 years beforehand had really surprisingly rarely been in Rome. For huge chunks of their papacy, they'd not been in Rome, and for significant chunks of their papacy, they'd not even been in the Papal States. And the reason for that is it was so violent. It was so easy for them to lose control of Rome. There was all sorts of politics among the population of Rome themselves, rival families who hadn't won out in the last papal election, anti-popes created by emperors who they were quarrelling with. So the popes, it is shocking. It's absolutely terrible, the Avignon papacy, but it was a longer time coming than perhaps people realised. And when it did happen, as often happens with these kind of calamities, people didn't realise it was happening. They didn't realise that the Pope was not going to go to Rome for 70 years when they elected Clement V. That was not the plan. They sleepwalked into it. And it's very interesting, again, with a lot of these things, it shows you that the crazy idea of sort of pseudo-infallibility of the prudential judgments of the popes, absolutely has to be set aside. It's unsustainable. For 70 years, contrary to divine law, the popes did not visit their own diocese, right? So popes can make serious and sustained poor prudential decisions, one has to bear that in mind. So the anyway, so Philip IV is keen to get Boniface VIII posthumously condemned. Clement V is scared of Philip IV. Now, Clement V, in fact, attended Boniface VIII's rival, well, his original council in Rome that Philip IV created his rival assembly to. And so he wasn't completely spineless, but he was pretty vacillating, and he was quite concerned about the situation he was in. And Philip IV was the original conflict had been caused by the fact that he was desperate for cash. He'd done a number of other nasty things, like he expelled all the Jews from France. And he cancelled all the debts that the Jews owed, and he stole all their property. And so now he decided that he was going to steal the property of the Knights Templar. Now, the Knights Templar are one of the two great military orders that had defended the Kingdom of Jerusalem. These are religious orders of knights who are not clerics. They have chaplains, but they're not themselves clerics. They're lay people in the sense of not being clerics, but they are religious. They're sworn to poverty, chastity, and obedience, and to fight to defend the Holy Land from the Muslims. And the first of these orders was the Hospitallers. They'd been founded originally just to provide accommodation and tend to the sicknesses and injuries of people visiting the Holy Land, but eventually they developed into a military order which physically defended against assault the people in the Holy Land. And one of the big problems was, even after the founding of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, is that a large majority of the population of the Holy Land were Muslim outside of the cities, and they weren't particularly enthusiastic about the Crusaders, albeit in fact there's some evidence they preferred being ruled by the Crusaders than being ruled by their Muslim rulers. But nevertheless, they thought the Christian pilgrims were fair game, and they were willing to attack and do horrible things, to enslave, murder, etc., rob and molest pilgrims coming to the Holy Land. And there was one particularly terrible attack on a group of several hundred pilgrims who were going from, in the second decade of the 12th century, were going down to Jericho to bathe in the Jordan, having visited Jerusalem, and they were very badly attacked and many terrible things happened to them. And this inspired the creation of a second military religious order, the Knights of the Temple. They became known as the Knights of the Temple because the King of Jerusalem allowed them to make use of the Al-Aqsa Mosque as their headquarters. Now, the Al-Aqsa Mosque is on top of the Temple Mount, the Temple platform, and it's one of the two great Islamic buildings on that platform that were built there after the Muslims captured Jerusalem. The other one is the Dome of the Rock, which probably stands on top of the actual spot where the Ark of the Covenant used to rest in Solomon's Temple. And so the medievals weren't entirely clear, it seems, that these were later buildings. They seem to think that they actually were the Temple of Solomon. So they became known as the Knights of the Temple. And they became extremely popular because people obviously were very concerned about preserving the Crusader states, but they also didn't. It was a big thing. There's this myth grew up in the 19th century and early part of the 20th century that people went on crusade in order to enrich themselves, that it was often younger sons who didn't have any inheritance who needed to make their fortune in the East. That's been utterly refuted over the last half century. It's very clear that you bankrupted yourself by going on crusade. You probably die. If you didn't die, you'd probably be bankrupt anyway. So the number of people and if you did end up with some kind of territory or landholding in the East, it would probably be greatly inferior to anything that you sold in order to be able to go there in the first place. So nobody was going there, pretty much, unless they were deeply misled. Nobody was going there for reasons of personal aggrandizement. And so a lot of them would go home. Most crusaders would go there, do a bit of fighting, visit the holy places. They would have redeemed their vow and they'd go home. So you've got most of them die. The ones who don't die go bankrupt. The ones who do get land get greatly inferior land, and most of the ones don't get land, they go home. So the big problem is the kings of Jerusalem are stuck with, like, well, who's actually going to defend this when there isn't a crusade on? we can't constantly be relying on tourists to defend the frontiers of the kingdom. But nobody wants to move there. They prefer the nice little farms back in France to the more greater challenges of agriculture in the Middle East. So the Kingdom of Jerusalem becomes increasingly dependent on the Templars and the Hospitallers as the sort of special forces to actually defend, because they're sort of permanently there. And so people appreciate this. So back in the West, it becomes a very fashionable cause to donate money and lands to the Templars and the Hospitallers to maintain their position in the Holy Land. And the Templars are particularly taken under the wing of St. Bernard, who's one of the greatest orators of all time, and so they become the biggest deal of the two of them. And so they're very wealthy. They've got a huge mystique around them. They're supposed to be the ultimate warriors, and they have priories all over the West. There's still a London Underground station called the Temple, or called Temple, which is where the House of the Knights Templar was. You can go and see it because it was taken over by the lawyers, and so they still have it there. And I think there's a Templar metro station in Paris as well. And so the now, in the course of exploding in importance and significance and becoming this huge order with this great mystique and prestige attached to them and enormous wealth, the Templars began to offer this service to people who wanted to go on pilgrimage to the Holy Land, because, as I say, it's very dangerous and you're quite likely going to get bankrupted by doing this pilgrimage. So one of the things that they do is they will take your money off you. So, for example, I did my doctorate at the University of Aberdeen, and I often used to go to a lovely little Catholic church in Aberdeen called St. Peter's, which is at the end of the sort of main street in Aberdeen, Union Street. And St. Peter's stands just next to where the house in the Middle Ages, and it's now pretty much a car park. But they would have had lands around Aberdeen. They would have administered them from that house in Aberdeen in the Middle Ages in the north of Scotland. And if you were a Scottish nobleman and you wanted to go on crusade, or you wanted to go on pilgrimage to the Holy Land, you would go to the Knights Templar and you would deposit with them your gold, and they would give you a credit note saying that you deposited your gold, and you would then go to Jerusalem. You'd fight your way through, you'd avoid all the perils and you get to Jerusalem, and you go to the Knights Templar in Jerusalem. You hand over to them your credit note from the Templars in Aberdeen, and they'll give you the equivalent sum in gold. So it was a very helpful service. However, of course, they legitimately levied a certain charge for the performance of this service. And then eventually, because they were tax exempt and exempt, they were a universal exempt religious order. They're tax exempt for the reason we talked about church property, and they're exempt from the authority of the local bishop and from the authority of the temporal ruler. So people would actually deposit their stuff with the Templars, not because they were going to the Holy Land, but just because they wanted to put it somewhere safe, where the temporal taxman couldn't get his hands on it. So they went from running travellers' checks to running deposit accounts and to charging legitimate charges on this. And then eventually people started saying, well, couldn't I just get some cash from you without actually having deposited any with you, and I'll pay you back later, and you can levy a charge for that service as well. And it's getting closer and closer and closer to being the condemned practice of usury, of lending money at interest. And so eventually huge numbers of significant temporal figures, including the King of France, became massively indebted to the Templars. Now the Master General, or the Grand Master of the Knights Templar, Guillaume de Beaujeu, died sword in hand at the fall of Acre in 1291, doing what he was supposed to do. Well, he wasn't supposed to lose, but he was certainly supposed to fight to the death to defend Acre, and there was quite a sort of a protracted siege of the Templar house because various civilians had taken refuge there, and the Templars refused to leave. And the Muslims were supposed to give them safe conduct in exchange for them agreeing to leave, and then they reneged on the safe conduct, and then so the Templars managed to rescue the people before they could be enslaved by the Muslims, and then the Muslims tried to undermine the walls in order to get in, and then finally they did undermine the walls, and the Muslims charged in order to murder and enslave the civilians and the Templars, but they'd undermined the walls so well the entire building collapsed on top of the civilians, the Templars and the Muslims, and they were all killed. So it was a slightly bizarre but rather dramatic way to go. And yeah, the last to reign in the Holy Land, Grand Master of the Knights Templar, died in the battle to defend Acre. So, you know, it seems pretty heroic, but you got to remember from what we saw with Celestine V, there's this moral panic sweeping through Christendom. They want to blame somebody. Why is God angry with us? Why have we lost control of the Kingdom of Jerusalem? What's going on? We invested a fortune in the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller, and they've lost the Holy Land. So, you know, what's happened to our money? And so the Knights Hospitaller, you know, were equally in trouble, right? The popularity was and the mystique were greatly damaged. You know, there was anger, and people wanted to know what had gone on and what had gone wrong. And the King of France owed them a lot of money. Now, the Knights Hospitaller had a tactical disagreement with the Knights Templar. The Knights Hospitaller wanted to do kind of guerrilla, chunk by chunk, fight for every piece of land, try and get a little bit back tactics, where in terms of trying to restore the Christian possessions in the Holy Land. Whereas the Knights Templar were like, no, this isn't going to work. What we need is a massive coalition. The King of France, King of England, Holy Roman Emperor, Papacy will come along, will be the special forces, but it's not going to work on this kind of incremental amateur basis. That hasn't worked. We need a massive, overwhelming, huge invasion of the Holy Land to recreate a defensible Kingdom of Jerusalem, you know, Edessa and Damascus, not just Jerusalem and Tyre and Tripoli and Acre. We need the whole kit and caboodle, and then it will be defensible. So there's this big difference. Now, one of the consequences of this tactical disagreement between the Templars and the Hospitallers is that the Templars aren't doing very much, because they're like, well, there's no point just doing little bits here and there. We need to negotiate a massive crusade, and then we'll be the special forces and the vanguard, and it'll be great. Whereas the Hospitallers are doing little bits and pieces here and there that they can, and one of the major things that they do in this precisely the right moment for them politically is that between 1306 and 1310 they managed to seize control of the island of Rhodes. Now, they're actually seizing it off the Byzantines, so it's not terribly edifying, but at least they are doing something, and they managed to get hold of a prestigious naval headquarters for the Knights Hospitaller. And to this day, they are known, because the Knights Hospitaller still exist, as the sovereign military order of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem, Rhodes and Malta. Mm-hmm. And for a long time they were known as the Knights of Rhodes, because that was their theocratic HQ, was Rhodes. Now, this is just the right moment, right, 1306, to have started doing this, because Clement V's been elected in 1305. He's kind of bit kidnapped by the King of France. He's stuck there in France, and at his coronation, Philip IV says, basically, he turns up, obviously, and he says, because it's in France, and he turns up and he says, okay, 2 matters of business, Your Holiness. Number 1, I want Boniface VIII posthumously condemned for heresy, sorcery, sodomy, cannibalism. I don't think he actually accuses him of cannibalism, but I mean, everything you can think of. And I want... And I've discovered terrible allegations against the Templars, who, as it happens, are unbelievably wealthy and who I owe a huge sum of money. So Philip IV claims that the Templars have become completely corrupt and wicked, and that they've become a secret sort of cult inside the church, that they've introduced a ceremony whereby they repudiate Christ upon becoming a knight, spit on a crucifix, that they worship an idol of some kind of strange head of Muhammad, that they're engaging in sodomy and sorcery and all sorts of things, and this provides a convenient explanation for why the Crusades have gone horribly wrong, right? Because God's really angry with the Templars, so that's the problem. So he comes up with all these allegations, and he's kind of cleverly running the two allegations simultaneously. So he's saying if Clement V doesn't cooperate with his attack on the Templars, he pushes further the attempt to get Boniface VIII posthumously condemned as a heretic. So Clement V is trying to play for time and desperately avoid condemning Boniface VIII as a heretic, but he's pretty sure that the Templars are innocent. Now, in 1307, and as I say, the Templars are the easy target because the Hospitallers have helpfully done something impressive and are doing something impressive while all this is going on in their attempt to conquer Rhodes. So people can't accuse them of not doing anything, the Hospitallers. So in 1307, in a kind of sweeping simultaneous attack, sort of FBI Food and Drugs Administration style, all the Templar houses are broken into, and the Grand Master of the Templars and all the Templars in France are arrested, and then Philip the Fourth subjects them to horrendous tortures. Basically, he's just got a list of stuff. You're guilty of this, and we're going to carry on torturing you until you admit you're guilty of this. So sort of 12 hours later, the two fingers left of the Templar signs the confession, right? So it's pretty brutal and pretty horrendous. And the vast majority of modern historians are convinced that the Templars were not guilty of any of this stuff. And one of the signs they're not guilty is that nobody else, the Pope is bullied into getting everybody else in Christendom to arrest them and to investigate the matter. And where there's a little bit of torture, there's some. So you've got to distinguish. Roman law permits torture. In fact, in some cases, classical Roman law required torture, but in those areas where the legal system is based on that, they allow torture. But this is, I'm not trying to endorse torture here, but this is proper judicial torture focused on finding out what the truth of the matter is, not focused on getting a particular result in order to avoid paying your debts, right? So in those areas, there's slight hints of possible guilt, but overwhelmingly they conclude that the charges are false and that there's no evidence, or at least they conclude there's no evidence whether or not the charges are false. Only in France, where the torture is focused on getting a particular result and is not proper judicial torture, do they overwhelmingly say that they're guilty. And as soon as the torture stops, the vast majority of them say that they're innocent and withdraw their confessions. And in Aragon and England, which don't allow torture as part of the judicial process, they don't find any evidence against them at all. And there's a sort of profoundly embarrassing exchange of letters between Edward I and Clement V, where Clement V kind of, did you torture them? And Edward I's kind of like, well, we don't really do that. And I mean, Edward I was not squeamish. You know, as I say, Braveheart is horrendously historically inaccurate film, but its depiction of Edward I as a very scary man is not really inaccurate in that sense. But he's like, well, no, we didn't torture them because, you know, that we don't do that kind of thing. He's like, well, torture them. And so, I mean, yeah, it's not good. But I mean, even in the places where they do torture them, they don't really find any convincing evidence of their guilt. So Philip IV responds by ramping up the campaign against Boniface VIII. So Clement V basically agrees to summon an ecumenical council to deal with the question. So that's why the Council of Vienne is summoned. Its ecumenicity is not to be doubted, but it certainly, Philip IV did stuff that could have started putting a case together, because he tried to veto certain bishops coming, and in the end every bishop in Christendom was allowed, it seems, to either come or at least send a procurator, someone to vote on their behalf. But not every bishop in Christendom was actually allowed to come. So often in these councils you'll have procurators on behalf of important bishops, like, say, the Eastern Patriarchs. But this is a very unusual case in which they actually weren't supposed to come. They weren't allowed to come. They just had to send a procurator on their behalf. So, and that's partly because Philip IV is trying to make sure that it doesn't go in any direction he doesn't like. So the council opens in Vienne, in France, in 1311. They begin. There's an investigation of the Templars begins. They examine both the bishops and the Holy See. In parallel, they examine the proceedings from the existing investigations, both in France and elsewhere in Christendom. They're not happy. They conclude that there isn't sufficient evidence for a condemnation. They want to run their own investigation. They want the Master General Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master of the Knights Templar, to be able to speak in person. Obviously, it's a requirement of natural justice that you shouldn't be tried in your absence, especially if you're willing to appear in your own defence. And the bishops obviously want this to happen. The Pope wants it to happen, though he's very coy about it because he's terrified of the King of France. The King of France is hanging around with heavy soldiery in the near vicinity of Vienne to make sure everybody feels the pressure. And so the final conclusion, which the Pope and the Council, really the Pope, with the acquiescence of the Council, reach, is that they abolish the Knights Templar by an administrative act. So the first, but not by a judicial decision. So the actual document, which is read to the Council and acquiesced in by the Council, which abolishes the Templars. It starts with a huge list of all the terrible things they've been accused of, and sort of insinuates by its tone that this is the reason for the loss of Jerusalem. There's lots of quoting of passages from the Old Testament about, we're in terrible shape because we've offended the Lord and all that kind of stuff. So it sounds like it's going to go towards, I don't know whether Clement V thought hopefully the King of France would get bored and not get to the end of the document, but it sounds like it's going to go to, and we find them guilty and we dissolve them for their wickedness and terrible stuff. And then it kind of, after all this thunderous Old Testament stuff, which sounds like he's going to find them guilty on all counts, he says, but we haven't really been able to investigate it properly, so who knows whether they're guilty or innocent. So as an administrative act, we're just suppressing them because their reputations are now so completely ruined that they couldn't do anything helpful anyway, so we're just going to squish them administratively, and whether they're guilty or not, we don't know. For everlasting memory, Clement V and the Council of Vienne. So it's utterly shoddy and extremely dodgy. But it's legally valid. Religious orders are creations of the Holy See, and I mean in this sense of international exempt organisations are creations of the Holy See, so the Holy See can destroy them, and so it did, and they were, and Philip IV was utterly vicious to them. He basically, when the torture was suspended and they withdrew their confessions, presumably because they were false confessions, he then says, right, because one of the things they were accused of was heresy and apostasy, so he says, right, you're now a relapsed heretic, so I can burn you at the stake. And this is all completely dodgy because it's not supposed to, these judgments do not belong to the temporal power. So, but he has all these Templars who withdraw their confessions once the torture stops, he has them all burnt at the stake. So, I mean, it's really, really, I mean, on the assumption, which seems overwhelmingly probable, that they were innocent, and certainly they were not given due process, so they were not legitimately convicted, whether they were innocent or guilty. But as I say, it's overwhelmingly likely they are innocent. Their fate was horrific, and a legend grew up that Jacques de Molay, the last Master General, had sort of screamed a curse against the King of France and possibly the Pope from the pyre as he was being burnt at the stake for being a relapsed heretic, and both Pope and King died within 1 year of his execution. But it seems as if the curse is apocryphal. But So one of the people who was present at the Council of Vienne was Giles of Rome, this great pupil of St. Thomas Aquinas, although he doesn't follow St. Thomas in everything, and he ends up as the founder of his own school, the Aegidians, because Aegidius is Giles in Latin, and he's so that the Augustinian friars are so enthusiastic about him that many years previously they'd in one of their general chapters. They're so like, yay, we've got one of the biggies, we've got the big intellectual figures like the other guys. Like, so they said they passed this decree saying that all Augustinians had to follow the opinions of Giles of Rome in everything that he'd written so far, and in anything that he would subsequently write, which is completely crazy. So absurd position, but it's part of the phenomenon which causes great harm to Christendom of the kind of football team religious order, which is that the religious orders, they become incredibly sort of competitive with each other, and everyone's expected to hold the opinions of the most famous theologian in that order, regardless of what they actually personally think. And this really damages the magisterium, because I mean, there's lots of things like the Immaculate Conception and the proper Catholic doctrine of predestination, which don't get predestination doesn't get resolved for centuries longer. The Immaculate Conception doesn't get defined for centuries longer than it needed to, because of the hostility between the Dominicans and the Franciscans, and the question of predestination has never been properly resolved because of the competitiveness between the Dominicans and the Jesuits. Although it's not just the Dominicans in that case; the other older religious orders all disagreed with the Jesuits. But this has been a great harm to this creation of these schools, which are kind of quasi football teams, intellectual football teams. And Giles of Rome was a beneficiary of this. Now, as I said earlier, Giles of Rome had written this work on the government of rulers for Philip IV, but then later on, during the great controversy over Unam Sanctam, he'd written this very important work, De Ecclesiastica Potestate, on the ecclesiastical power, which is a sort of a book-length defense of the doctrine of Unam Sanctam. And there's a nice bilingual edition done by a guy called Dyson, as far as I know, unrelated to the vacuum cleaner manufacturer, which you can buy at a reasonably affordable price last time I checked. And it's well worth reading. And there's a lot of people think that Giles of Rome actually wrote Unam Sanctam, and certainly the on the ecclesiastical power comes off as sort of like like it's Star Wars, the illustrated dictionary. Well, you kind of on the ecclesiastical power is like Unam Sanctam, the illustrated companion and guide, and so it's well worth reading. But and as I say, he was actually the superior of the Augustinians as well. But he, interestingly, Giles of Rome is at Vienne, and he seems to have thought the Templars were guilty, and he wrote a book called Contra Exemptos, which is particularly striking because, as I say, he's the superior of an international exempt religious order. But and it's very striking, given modern difficulties we've had with all these abuse problems and things, that the work is he assumes the guilt of the Templars, and he blames it on the fact that the Holy See has been going around creating all of these exempt religious orders, and essentially what the Holy See does by that is make them, as it were, monks of the Diocese of Rome, so that they're subject to the oversight and disciplinary power only of the Pope rather than of the local diocesan bishop. And Giles argues that that this is a recipe for disaster, because the popes are it's attractive to the popes because that means they have people who are very loyal to them all over the church, but it's a recipe for disaster because they don't the popes are just not capable of exercising that kind of supervision over people dispersed over the entire world. And I have a friend who's involved in an investigative committee which is looking into various abuse problems, and among them things to do with rogue ecclesiastical institutions. And I was just reading a year or so ago about Giles's arguments, and my friend rang me up, and she started complaining about this very phenomenon that the Holy See is not properly equipped to supervise these organisations, and Giles basically says there should only be a few of them so that it's actually manageable, which again is echoing the sentiment of Lateran IV that there shouldn't be any new forms of religious life, and they got this idea about the four holy rules of Augustine, Francis, Benedict, and Basil. So I must say, given both the doctrinal and in some cases moral collapse of so many religious communities in the last 60, 70 years. It's hard not to sympathise with Giles, but then it's mysterious because of the overwhelming weight of evidence that the Templars seem to have been innocent. So I don't know. It's probably going to remain a mystery. Probably Philip IV was intending to steal all the Templars' land. Clement V tries to outflank him on that front and make sure that the land is reassigned for the purpose for which it was given, so that the land is given to the Hospitallers, who are supposed to be doing the same things as the Templars were. Probably Philip IV wouldn't have allowed that to happen. He never hands over any of the land, but he dies a year later. So as a consequence, because of the fortuitous death of this nasty king, in fact, not only does he die, but within one generation, his entire the direct Capetian French dynasty becomes extinct, which eventually leads to the 100 Years' War between England and France, which is another reason for the popularity of the apocryphal story of Jacques de Molay's curse from the pyre. But because of his death, the land does largely get properly reassigned to the Hospitallers, so it's not completely wasted. And the Hospitallers do important and good stuff, albeit they don't reconquer the Holy Land, all the way up until, I'm sure they still do important and good stuff, but all the way up to, on a crusading front of one sort or another, all the way up to the 18th century, they're still in possession of Malta, and they famously prevent Malta from falling into the hands of Islam at various occasions. In the meantime, although they lose Rhodes, sadly. There are various of the usual kind of canonical measures taken by the council, like Second Council of Lyon. The Pope asks for reports on problems in the church, and then the bishops try and deal with it. But there's two other very important doctrinal things which they do, one connected to Giles of Rome, and one connected probably to the disgrace of the Templars. The first is that there is a philosopher and theologian called Peter John Olivy, who lived from 1247 to 1298, and he had denied that the intellectual soul is the form of the body. Now this was actually most people nowadays think that they have a silly, false understanding of what the church means by the soul. They think it means some kind of glowy, disembodied mind, angel thing that kind of dwells inside your body as if it was a machine. This is completely false to the scriptures, and false to the perennial philosophy, the true Catholic philosophical tradition. But there had been a certain degree of unclarity about the precise nature of the soul, although everything tended in this direction. But it is really St. Thomas who properly clarifies the nature of the soul in his writings, his commentary on Aristotle's De Anima and his treatise on the soul in the first part of the Summa Theologiae. And but this theologian Olivy, he had denied that the human intellect was the form of the body. So when you say the form of the body, it means that the humanness, that the soul is united to the matter of the body, as the humanness of the man is united to the stuff, as it were, that the man is made of. So like the if you've got a wooden triangle, you have, as it were, the form of triangularity and the matter of wood. I mean, this is a horrendous oversimplification, but anyway, so in the same way, you have the form of man is united to the matter which makes this individual man. Although Scotists would get very upset at me saying it that way. But anyway, and he had denied that the properly rational soul, the rational faculties of the soul, of the nature of their rationality, informed the matter of the body. Yeah, this would take 12 podcasts to explain properly. But anyway, as Giles managed to arrange for this opinion to be condemned, and as a result, solemnly defined dogmatically that the soul is the form of the body, which is quite important. Now, there are various, very important for Catholic anthropology, and it shows what a high level, albeit we're in a period of decline, but from a very high point. So the intellectual life of the church is at a very high level at this point, so that you can hardly imagine an ecumenical council in later centuries defining something so philosophical. But that's a sign, just like it's a sign of our present decline that no one's been back to the moon since the 1970s. So it's a sign of general ecclesiastical decline that questions of this sublimity are not considered by ecumenical councils and the magisterium anymore. But interestingly, it probably gets, a lot of people treat that as essentially just defining St. Thomas's doctrine of the soul. There are other schools in the church among this kind of football team, a religious order, schools of philosophy and theology, who would not like that because they don't like St. Thomas's doctrine of the soul, particularly this dispute between the Scotists and the Thomists about whether or not matter is the principle of individuation. But probably it gets closer to being a definition of St. Thomas's understanding of the soul on account of an earlier definition, which people have probably largely forgotten about, of the Fourth Council of Constantinople, which, if you search back in your memory, defined that there is only one human soul. So anyway, it's a very important definition, and it's cited in the Catechism and various places. There's an interesting discussion of this question by Joseph Ratzinger in his Eschatology textbook, which he wrote before he was Pope, quite a long time before he was Pope. Yes, and the other definition is that it is a heresy to deny that usury is mortally sinful. So lots of ecumenical councils actually deal with the question of usury, but mostly they deal with it as large, with it by implication doctrinal, because they say lots of thunderous doctrinal sounding things about it, but when they actually get to the kind of meat and potatoes of it, it's usually a disciplinary provision. So Vienne is unique in that it dogmatically defines that anyone who denies that usury is a mortal sin is a heretic, and that's very important for understanding Catholic doctrine on economics and Catholic social teaching, because in fact once you understand why usury is immoral, it's very helpful in understanding a huge amount of the economic parts of Catholic social teaching. And if you leave that out, it just becomes a rather woolly and arbitrary series of sentiments. But once you reinsert the dogma that of the immorality of usury, it kind of, everything clicks into place and it becomes much more systematic and comprehensible. So there we are. That's the Council of Vienne. So it does two very important doctrines. Extremely wicked and shameful disciplinary thing, and destroys one of the greatest religious orders in the history of the church, and while not having the courage, like, dare one say it, Pilate, I have nothing to do with the death of these innocent Templars, it says, looking the other way as they scream amidst the terrible flames. So so it's not edifying, but it did do some important things, and unfortunately it's kind of the curtain raiser on the 70-year-long catastrophic exile of the papacy in France.
Next up is the Council of Constance, right?
That's right, the other end of the catastrophe.
Who said that there's no problems before the 1960s? Doctor, appreciate it, man. Have a good one.